guilty. For the first time, a top Trump campaign aide is pleading guilty in the Mueller probe. Now, this is not an advisor. This is not a volunteer. This is a man who was entrusted to help run Donald Trump's campaign. You can see him there leaving federal court. That was today after pleading guilty to conspiracy and making a false statement. Former deputy campaign chairman Rick Gates not only pleading to those charges, but also admitting to a whole lot more. And legally, that's very important. What I'm about to report here are activities that, as of today, brand new breaking news, Gates admits to, and that means he can testify about them against other people. In the material here, it's what's called overt acts. Mueller getting Gates today to admit to secret foreign lobbying, potentially illegal mortgage schemes, and helping Paul Manafort cheat on avoiding his taxes. Not good. Now, that's big news tonight, as well as Mueller putting new heat on Paul Manafort in completely separate charges. This was breaking just moments ago. Manafort hit with these new charges, which include lying to federal investigators even after Donald Trump took office. I have more on that in a moment. Now, both these stories are linked, of course, because these men were partners both in business and in Trump land. Gates also admitting to hiding foreign lobbying with Paul Manafort for a key ally of Putin in Ukraine. Tonight's charges also show how aggressively Bob Mueller is going after anyone who lies anytime. He got Gates to plead guilty to lying to investigators after he was indicted. If that sounds weird, unusual, or just plain stupid, well, it's all of those things, and we have a special report with the prosecutor on that later this hour. Now, here is why all of this is so bad for Paul Manafort. He is, in a sense, the last one standing, but with a lot coming at him. Gates agreeing tonight to cooperate fully, to turn over all documents, and potentially to testify in court. That means basically to testify, we believe, against Paul Manafort. Now, Mueller already had a ton of evidence on Manafort. What's different tonight? He now has cooperating Manafort's alleged co-conspirator. I am joined by former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance, as well as Bill Kristol, founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, and a lot more guests in this segment and ahead. But I wanted to begin with you all. Joyce, you look at what's happening here. You look at what is basically two breaking stories for us. Gates pleading, which is very significant given his senior role in the campaign, and new charges against Manafort. What does it tell you?
It tells you that Mueller has a very decided game plan, that he has amassed a lot of information, and that as he begins to acquire new cooperators, he's able to very quickly marshal their information and put it to use. But it also tells us that Mueller is staunchly defending the institution that he loves and has spent so much of his life working on behalf of, the Justice Department and the FBI, going to lengths to include in this plea bargain for Gates the requirement that he plead guilty to lying to the FBI during his proffer session. That should really be a shot across the bow for anybody else who's lied to the FBI during this investigation. Mueller's letting them know he will hold them accountable. Yeah, and that's truly remarkable, and we're going to continue to dig into that when you think about basically a new crime that occurred there. And Bill, as a legal reporter, I often talk about both sides of the case. This is one of those nights with regard to Rick Gates where there is no other side left. He is confessing, admitting, pleading to conspiracy against the United States, pleading to lying to Mueller and the FBI, and adding these other things that he's willing to do. Now, Paul Manafort says, notwithstanding Gates' plea today, I continue to maintain my innocence. This does not alter my commitment to defend myself against the untrue, piled up charges. Bill, as I say, two sides of the story for Manafort, because he is presumed innocent in the eyes of the law, but there's overwhelming evidence. Rick Gates, one side of the story. How do you view the pressure mounting on Manafort tonight?
Well, as you say, the pressure is mounting, but I was trying to think about it. What is Donald Trump thinking? And I think what Donald Trump is thinking is this is getting awfully close. And I've got to think that in terms of either moving against Mueller through Rosenstein or somehow trying to curb the investigation on the one hand, or pardons on the other hand, I wonder if we're getting close to an inflection point. I think Kushner is the key now, I suspect. I suspect that Mueller wanted to send the signal to Kushner, who I think has only spent an hour or two with Mueller, if I'm not mistaken, that if and when he chooses to is called to testify, that line will be taken seriously. I'd be pretty surprised if Kushner's lawyer lets him testify. Maybe he'll take the Fifth. At that point, you can imagine Donald Trump saying, this is a witch hunt. They're going after my family. There are a bunch of perjury traps here. It's not Russia collusion anyway. It's financial stuff, which was always a red. Remember Trump said months ago that was the red line. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this will just play out. Maybe Trump will passively watch it and gripe about it and tweet occasionally about it. But I wonder how much. I mean, he's tough. He's tough when he's cornered in his own way. He has a certain kind of cunning. I got to think he's not just passively going to accept this and watch this unspool. I think he may act.
Do you think that Donald Trump is worried about what Paul Manafort and Mike Flynn know about him?
Yes.
Yeah. Joyce?
He also has to be worried about what Manafort and Gates can jointly testify to about others close to him. Does this, do they have the nail in the coffin for Don Jr. or Kushner, assuming that Mueller doesn't already have it? And who else in his inner circle can they talk about? Because remember, they were both involved during the convention when there was the weakening of the Republican position against Russia. That was that first time that we saw it, and they may know more details about who was involved and what was traded for that change in the Republican platform. So I agree with Bill.
You make a great point there, and it echoes in what we see today. Donald Trump today was fending off criticism of Jared Kushner, saying, oh, well, he's not paid. Well, Paul Manafort wasn't paid. There is a huge problem legally and otherwise with people who both are unpaid but have debts because they have conflicts. I want you both to stay with me before I bring in the next experts. And this is a show, I have to say, journalistically, I'm very excited about all the experts we have. But let's look at who Rick Gates was as a member of the Trump campaign. He was there. You can see it on the stage at the RNC convention right there with Donald Trump. And they were on a first-name basis.
Come on up, Rick. We have a group of people that really wants to win and I think knows how to win.
Manafort brought Gates in, and a Trump advisor who remains at his side in the White House, who you will recognize, touting him here as part of Trump's Core Four.
Here in Trump Tower today, the Core Four, Manafort and Gates, who have been on for a while, Bannon and myself, we met on any number of issues. Paul Manafort is the chairman and Rick Gates, his deputy, have done a phenomenal job in building out this campaign over the last maybe 5 or 6 months.
And we broaden out to our Core Four, MSNBC political analyst Rick Stengel, who was also Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration, David Rothkopf, a senior fellow, I should say, at Johns Hopkins, and a Clinton veteran, along with Joyce and Bill. Stay with us. David, I'm sure you're excited to be a part of the Four.
Yes.
What are you thinking when you look at all of this? And if anyone at home is saying, oh, Rick Gates was not the most flamboyant, or he didn't do as much TV as Kellyanne Conway, and yet, as we just showed, if you don't know Rick Gates at home, that's fine. You know who did know him? Donald Trump.
Well, I'm thinking two things. First of all, I think this has been a week in which we've seen Mueller really flex his muscles. When Gates struggled a little bit, Mueller said, okay, we're going in now. We're going to up the ante. I'm going to lay a bunch of these new indictments on the table. He's laid a new indictment on the table with Manafort. When Manafort struggles a little bit, he sent a message to lawyers that if the lawyers don't tell the truth, he sent a message to Gates that if he didn't tell the truth during the plea bargaining session, he's going to go after them. But the other thing that strikes me is this week. Last week it was 13 people talking about the Russian troll factory in St. Petersburg. We haven't even had the conversation yet on the Russian hacking of the election.
Right.
We haven't seen Roger Stone yet. We haven't seen the people involved in the collusion yet. George Papadopoulos pleaded guilty. He has nothing to do with Manafort and Gates in this particular story. So if I'm Donald Trump, I don't just see one super highway leading at me. I'm at the center of a roundabout. There's 6 or 7 or 8 roads. I'm in the center of all of them. And Mueller's message is, I'm coming with both guns blazing, and I am going to use every tool available to me to ensure that when I get to you, you're got.
Wow. And you know, Rick Stengel, David Rothkopf saying this is just this week. Earlier this week was a lawyer for these gentlemen. Last week was the Russians. I'm reminded of David Bowie, who famously said this Thursday is just as important as last Thursday, which is almost a spiritual level. But David makes the point that at the legal level of the heat, Mueller's not done, and next week could bring more surprises.
So I'm a little mystified about the focus on Manafort. And what I'm going to do is commit some geopolitics here, Ari. and put it in a very larger context. Because what Manafort represents is a connection to Vladimir Putin. Because Manafort and Gates worked for Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine. What did Viktor Yanukovych start? He started the great revolt in Ukraine against Russia and the Euromaidan. Why? Because he wanted to veto legislation that would have put Ukraine in the EU market, as opposed to what Russia wanted, to go into a Russia market. Viktor Yanukovych was a pawn of the Russians. His closest advisor was Paul Manafort and Rick Gates.
So let me have you build on that point and reading from, again, this brand new material we got, because you're digging in deeper to why this is so important. I'm reading now from what Gates pled to, not a debate, but what he said he did, directing these companies to lobby members of Congress about the, quote, propriety of Yanukovych, as you mentioned, the Putin guy you just mentioned, imprisoning his rival.
Yes, I mean, this is, it's sinister, because what this really is fake news, which is that consultants are paying so-called statesmen, European statesmen, to take the line on television shows like this, supporting Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. I mean, it's utterly corrupt. And so I'm putting more dots on the screen to sort of connect the dots. You have Putin on with a kind of puppeteer master of Paul Manafort, really, through his connection to Viktor Yushchenko.
So, David, take that point out, David, and then Joyce, how that works if another theory of the case, if Mueller's not done, is investigating and probing whether Paul Manafort was working for free for Trump, but getting paid by somebody else to ultimately try to bend the Trump campaign or ultimately U.S. policy towards that foreign bidder. And does that create other problems? David, and then Joyce.
Well, I think it does create other problems. It creates potentially other problems for Manafort and those around Manafort. And it speaks to the point that Mueller is allowed to go and explore any crimes that he encounters in search of this core crime, which has to do with the Russians. But I think, going back to Rick's very good point, this investigation is at its core about a big-time war that Vladimir Putin is waging against Western democracy.
Right.
And he was waging it in Ukraine, and he's waging it in Europe. He's involved himself in other campaigns, whether it's in France or in Austria, or the campaign involved with Brexit, or perhaps now in Italy. And what he looks for is people that he can have leverage over, and people with financial problems like Manafort, people without values like Manafort, potentially like Jared Kushner, potentially like Donald Trump, people where he has some leverage, and he's trying to use that leverage. Now, at the end of the day, the Trump people may say, well, we were just dupes, we were just being used. But of course, Donald Trump was running to be president of the United States. The people around him should know better.
Right.
And they essentially put themselves in a position to be used. And all this other stuff that they do about ethics, where they say, you're not going to see our tax returns. You're not going to see who we're doing business with. We're going to keep doing business with some of those people. Open them up further to this kind of black.
Well, let's take your point and pass it over to Joyce Vance to bring it home, as I know Joyce is so good at doing intellectually, because Joyce, David just committed to a phrase, quote, people without values. And that itself is a value judgment. Walk us through the difference between that, which is people in both parties, by the way, who've done some very unsavory things on behalf of Putin's allies for money or other reasons, people without values, and what Mueller has to look at, which is not just what someone might see as a values deficit, but whether they lied in their foreign lobbying, or whether they laundered money, or whether they promised a quid pro quo for something regarding U.S. government action or sanctions. How does you take David's category and apply it to what Mueller's doing?
Mueller can only prosecute people for committing federal crimes. He has to have evidence to prove every element of those crimes. He won't be prosecuting people for having bad character. He won't be going on a witch hunt. And so it's a very specified process. The interesting thing, Ari, as you know, is that federal prosecutors love to talk about Mueller rolling up the chain, going from the bottom of the operation up to the top. I think we're going to have to replace that metaphor with the idea that Mueller instead is throwing a net, and he's casting that net very broadly over everyone who has evidence about criminal conduct that involved collusion in this election. We may not see how some of these outlying pieces come together just yet. I think we know a little bit more today than we knew a week ago, but ultimately this is all going to be part of that same massive effort by Mueller to help the American people understand what happened in the election and then what of it is criminal, what can be prosecuted, as opposed to what's just merely poor character.
It's really fascinating you say that because so much of this, as you mentioned, involves a hierarchical model, and that certainly applies to major crime organizations or large companies, and Mueller has experience in that. But as you say, a net or a networked approach might make a lot more sense here, particularly given how many weird and strange and even unpaid people were circling the periphery of this campaign but seemed to get involved in some very big operations.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.